To create my candle cakes, I have simply baked two 8-inch square Victoria sponge cakes. You can find a separate tutorial for this recipe in the description below this video. All I want to do now is simply take a 4-inch round cake drum and I'm going to cut out 4 circles from the cake. The reason I am doing it this way instead of doing a 4-inch round cake is because the drum is always the same size as the cake tin and the cake always ends up slightly smaller. So if you do it this way, you'll end up with a much better size and less of a gap around the edges. Now I want one candle smaller than the other, so I'm going to use one of my cakes to cut out 4 of these, and I'm only going to cut 3 4-inch round circles from the other cake. Now we need to stack and crumb coat our cake. So for the first candle, I have 4 of the circles that I've cut out. My buttercream recipe, you will also find that in the description below this video. That's a separate tutorial. And simply coat each layer of cake and then place the next layer on top. Now, due to this candle being so high, I am choosing not to use jam. However, you can use jam in the centre if you want to. However, if you do this, treat it like a 2-tiered cake and add some cake dowels halfway up and another cake board just to separate them. This is only for tutorial purposes, so I've just gone with buttercream. If you're doing it with fruit cake, there'll be no need for anything like that whatsoever because a fruit cake is very stable. I will be placing a cake dowel down the centre of this just to help prevent it from wobbling too much. So simply fill it like this, cover all of the sides with the buttercream, then we will get on to the next step. Now I want to add my cake dowel. This will just help prevent any of the layers from swaying from side to side. But remember, as soon as it's covered with fondant anyway, and that fondant has been allowed to set, this will hold your cake together so well. Fondant holds in so much. So all I have done is just marked a line with a pencil, and I'm actually using a pipe cutter to cut this. You'll find it an awful lot easier to cut your dowels with these. A very, very handy tool, and they're not too expensive. See how easy that was? Now simply place the dowel straight into the centre of your cake, and then on top of this, add your 4-inch round cake drum. This cake drum is what is going to keep your cake protected from the actual candle that we will be using later in this tutorial. After leaving your cake in the fridge for a good hour and a half just to allow the buttercream to set, this is what you will have achieved. Simply repeat this process for the smaller candle. Once our cakes are thoroughly chilled, we now need to cover them with fondant. Here I am using 5mm spacers, a sharp knife, some icing sugar, a large rolling pin, some smoothers, and I am choosing to use the normal Renshaw's ready to roll icing. We're simply going to be covering our cakes one at a time, but make sure they are thoroughly chilled first. You'll understand why in a moment. Here I have 1 kilogram of the Renshaw's fondant, and I have rolled it first of all, so it's roughly the same height as the candle, just a bit bigger. The job now is to simply roll this in between spaces, but it needs to be really, really long. I'm not trying to get a circular shape here. If you don't have spacers, it doesn't matter, but they do help keep your fondant the same thickness throughout. So continue to roll this out until you've got the perfect oblong shape. This is why your cake needs to be perfectly chilled. I like to do things my own way, and I found it very easy as long as you leave it in the fridge long enough. you can place the cake on its side and actually roll it with the fondant. So if you are a beginner baker, or if you're like me and just like to do things slightly different, remember there's never any wrong or right way in cake decorating. I find this process so much easier, and I have actually done this with a 4-tiered 6-inch round cake filled with both jam and buttercream. This is why I knew it would work. You literally just have to let that butter go rock hard before you can do this process. So patience is the key. So you can see I'm using my hands an awful lot. The reason I do this is when a cake's been in the fridge and that buttercream is really, really, really hard, you don't need to really add any water to the buttercream to allow the fondant to stick to it. If you use your hands, it's naturally going to warm up that butter and the fondant will stick to it naturally. Cut off the excess fondant. Just check to see if you've cut off enough. Remember, do not cut off too much because then you're left with a gap. And you'll be left with a small seam. But whilst the cake is still cold, you can actually roll it on the work surface and help get rid of that seam, as well as using the heat from your hands to help push that fondant together beautifully. It's really, really simple to do. And then all I'm going to do is flip the cake over, put the base on the board and trim off any excess fondant from the top of the actual cake. You can see how I'm rolling it there. It's not damaging the cake in any way, shape or form. And you'll also notice I put fondant in line with the base of the cake. That's because I wanted to trim off all the fondant from the top instead. So make sure you do it that way round and then simply repeat this process for your smaller of the two candles. Now we need to cover the top of the cake where the actual cake drum is. So just using some water to allow the fondant to adhere to it and a brush. Simply brush the top and then I'm just going to cut out 2 circles, again 5mm thick. I would not advise that you eat any of the fondant or the royal icing drip that we will be doing soon from the top of the cake. When you want to eat your cake, this cake drum can simply be removed where the candle has also been placed, which keeps all of your cake completely food grade. All of the sides are still protected with fondant, so it helps protect it from the air. That's if you're doing a Victoria sponge. If you're doing a fruit cake, obviously it'll be marzipan and fondant. And it's just a fantastic way to have a great centerpiece because depending on the tea lights that you actually purchase, they can burn for a good 2 to 3 hours. Yes, it will start to affect the fondant, the heat from the actual tea light, but it'll just make your candle look even more authentic. If the fondant starts to melt slightly, it's just going to make it look more real. So take your time with this process and don't worry too much about the seam because it's going to be completely covered both with royal icing and some snowflakes. Now we need to add both cakes to the decorated cake drum. Now if you leave your cakes in the fridge for long enough, you will be able to physically pick them up like I just have. Do not be afraid to put your cakes in the fridge. Sweating is normal, and the colder the environment that they come out into, the less they will sweat. I just want to mention Sweet Stamps by Amy's Cakes whilst I'm here. You'll see that lovely text on the cake drum. There is a separate tutorial showing you exactly how you can do this and what you need to achieve it will be in the link below that tutorial. Now, all I'm doing here is using a small round circle cutter and I'm cutting away some of that fondant, and this is to leave an indentation for me so I've got somewhere to place my little tea light. Once I've added the tea light in there, you can see it's surrounded by metal. I'm just going to place it in the centre, and then to make my candle look a little bit more authentic, you just want to use your fingers, random shapes, and place them around that tea light just to hide it a little bit more. The royal icing will do a lot of the work for you, but just push it down as though the candle has already started to melt. Repeat this for both of your candles. And this is the sort of effect that you're aiming to achieve. Don't worry about adding too much. It will look perfect once the royal icing is on there. Add your second cake, repeat this process, and then we will add a few snowflakes. If you wanted to, these candles would look great just left how they are. However, I'm choosing to use the Katie Sue Impression Mat. Now, I've found as long as you use a really good modelling paste, I've used the Saracino model paste, you can create these really intricate, detailed snowflakes. And I'm simply going to attach these to my cake using a small amount of edible glue. Now it's time for the royal icing drip. In the UK, we do have the safest eggs in the world, so the recipe that I'm going to leave for you in the description below this video is fine to use if you are in the UK and you only use eggs with the lion stamp on them. If you're in another part of the world, I would recommend using an egg white powder if you choose to use royal icing, or you could always just go for your basic candy melts instead. So I have placed the royal icing in my piping bag. I'm simply going to trim off the end, so you don't need a piping nozzle. And this is where you want to take your time. Now I need to do it where I can't really see it because I need to make sure you guys can. Start in one area and just gently push. The more royal icing or candy melts that you push out of your piping bag, eventually gravity will pull it down. So when you move a little bit further over, don't squeeze out quite as much royal icing or candy melts. This will make all your drips very different lengths. It'll look more authentic, and simply do this all the way around both of your candles. I will fast forward this part for you, but once you have finished doing the drips around the outside of the candle, to make it look more authentic, you then want to fill in the top of the candle. It does not have to be neat. Remember, this is supposed to be a candle, the wax is melting, even though it's edible wax. So take your time with this process because this is where you really don't want to go wrong. I've simply repeated that process for both of the candles, and as you can see, the drips have moved down there perfectly by themselves. I just want to add one last finishing touch, and as you will see in the photos, I did add a few more snowflakes afterwards as well. Because no one will be eating any of the fondant or the royal icing where the candles are, and all of that cake's protected by the cake drum, I've decided to add a small amount of food contact glitter. I'm simply going to sprinkle this on the top of each candle whilst the royal icing is still setting, just so it acts like a natural glue and to make it that little bit more Christmassy. And there we have it. All you need to do now is light those stunning tea lights and have it in the centre of your Christmas table. Happy baking, everyone, and I will be back soon with more new content.